And the big secret is that I'm married.
How much deception can be hidden behind the mask of love? Imagine surrendering everything: the glittering life of California, your homeland, a well-established career, and your entire life savings, only to cross oceans and find that your dream palace is actually a horrifying psychological prison. How would that feel? This is exactly Jenny's story. A 10-year-long relationship, which from the outside looked like a flawless fairy tale, hid a most despicable truth behind the flash of the cameras. The dream of building a beautiful future in India, holding Sumit's hand, slowly morphed into an unspeakable nightmare, where love was entirely replaced by humiliation, profound neglect, and meticulously calculated lies. This is not just a story of a breakup. It is a spine-chilling saga of a human being's dignity being crushed piece by piece, and her triumphant rise from those ashes like a phoenix. Before we dive deep into this dark and horrifying truth, I urge you to hit the like button right now and subscribe to our channel, making sure to ring the notification bell. Your support fuels our ability to uncover and bring you more of these profound, shocking investigative stories. When Jenny first stepped off the plane, trading the free, independent air of California for the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of that unfamiliar Indian city, her eyes were brimming with hope. She had crossed oceans, defying a decade of emotional turmoil, geographical barriers, and societal judgments, all to finally be with the man she loved. But she had absolutely no idea that Sumit's world had not prepared a warm welcome for her. From the very first moment she crossed the threshold of Sumit's family home, a dark and harrowing chapter of Jenny's life began. Every peeling wall of that house seemed to constantly remind her that she was nothing more than an unwanted intruder. Forget any acknowledgement of her 10 years of monumental sacrifices. She was denied even the most basic dignity of a wife or a daughter-in-law. Instead, she was relegated to a position that could never be called family. She was merely an unpermitted guest whose very existence was a source of extreme discomfort for everyone in the house, particularly for Sumit's mother, Sadhna. Sadhna's piercing, judgmental gaze and draconian rules began to slowly crush Jenny's independent spirit. What Jenny would wear when she woke up in the morning, how she would speak, what she would eat at the dining table, or how she would walk, every single breath of her life was seized and controlled by Sadhna. The woman who once lived life on her own terms in California was now brutally forced to scrub the damp, grimy floors of Sumit's house. Standing in the smoky, stifling environment of the kitchen, she was subjected to a relentless barrage of sharp, degrading insults that pierced her self-esteem like poisoned arrows. In every agonizing moment of humiliation, Jenny would desperately look toward Sumit, hoping against hope that the man she had loved for 10 years would stand up for her just once, that he would finally declare her as his wife. But that flicker of hope was repeatedly extinguished by the impenetrable darkness of Sumit's cowardice. Sumit's silence was infinitely more terrifying than Sadhna's verbal assaults. Whenever Jenny tried to protest the glaring injustices, whenever she begged for her fundamental human rights, Sumit would immediately raise an invisible, impenetrable shield of cultural and familial obligations. He weaponized heavy, loaded phrases like Indian culture, the tradition of the joint family, and respect for parents to weave a suffocating web of manipulation. Sumit masterfully used these concepts to mentally paralyze Jenny. In modern psychology, this is known as gaslighting. Sumit constantly manipulated Jenny into believing that all this humiliation, all this agonizing neglect, was not a real problem at all, but rather a profound flaw within Jenny herself. He convinced her that because she was a foreigner, she simply lacked the capacity to understand their rich culture. Sumit cloaked his own spinelessness and utter cowardice in the glittering wrapping of cultural heritage, forcing Jenny to believe that the entire burden of adjusting to this suffocating nightmare rested solely on her shoulders. Under this calculated, day-to-day psychological torture, Jenny slowly began to lose her very identity. She began to question her own sanity, wondering if she really was the one at fault. Her self-confidence plummeted to absolute zero. But in this vast, treacherous ocean of deception, Jenny had not even seen the tip of the true iceberg yet. The most devastating and catastrophic blow landed when Jenny finally uncovered Sumit's deepest, darkest secret. The most abhorrent chapter of the flawless web of lies Sumit had woven over 10 long years was the concealment of his first marriage. Yes, the very Sumit for whom Jenny had sacrificed her country, her family, and her life savings to cross the 7 seas was already a married man. When this horrifying truth was finally unmasked, the ground completely shattered beneath Jenny's feet. Every word, every promise, every intimate moment of the past decade suddenly morphed into one colossal, sickening fraud. She realized with bone-chilling clarity that she had bet her entire life on a man who had merely been playing a cruel, psychological game with her. This revelation completely destroyed Jenny mentally. Stranded in a foreign land, utterly alone, she found herself trapped among people who were hell-bent on her destruction. Sumit's unimaginable betrayal turned Jenny into a helpless victim of circumstance, backing her into a corner where she had no choice but to remain agonizingly silent. Even if she wanted to scream and cry, she could not, because the very walls around her seemed to be mocking her agony. This monstrous lie proved that their relationship had never been built on anything resembling equality. Sumit had ruthlessly exploited Jenny's vulnerabilities, manipulating her blind love to use her as a mere pawn on his chessboard. After discovering this horrifying truth, Jenny's days dragged on like a relentless, endless nightmare. The bright, smiling woman from California slowly transformed into a living corpse. A shadow of unspoken terror and profound despair permanently settled across her face. Unable to speak the local language, surrounded by unfamiliar streets, and with absolutely nothing left in her pockets, Jenny was literally reduced to a state of captivity. Sumit's family seemed to have been eagerly waiting for this exact vulnerability. They began to corner her so aggressively, pushing her so close to the edge, hoping she would either go entirely mad and flee the house, or submit forever, obeying their commands like an indentured servant. Sadhna escalated the psychological torment to unprecedented levels. Jenny was no longer just expected to perform bone-breaking manual labor. She was constantly reminded that she was an unwanted, cursed woman who was supposedly destroying Sumit's life. Every sentence Sadhna spat out was a calculated, surgical strike, designed to make Jenny's bruised and battered heart bleed all over again, and Sumit just continued his old, deceptive tactics. Sometimes he would hold Jenny's hand, putting on a sickening theatrical display of false remorse, trying to pacify her with empty words of comfort. This terrifying duality of Sumit only confused Jenny even more, trapping her in a labyrinth of doubt. She could not decipher if Sumit actually loved her or if this was just another elaborate trap. The truth was, Sumit never wanted a life partner. He wanted a blindly obedient slave. A woman who would nod at his every command, silently endure all the abuses of his family, and demand absolutely no rights in return. Sumit's sickening demand for absolute obedience exposed the intense patriarchal arrogance and extreme selfishness lurking within him. Under the guise of love, he had locked Jenny inside a cage, holding the only key alongside his family. Jenny slowly began to realize exactly what she had gained from this 10-year relationship. She had given him her youth, her wealth, and her mental peace, and in return, she received nothing but a hollow chest of emptiness and betrayal. Night after night, she would lie awake, staring into the dark, wondering how she could have been so incredibly blind. How could she have stepped so willingly into a monster's trap? But human endurance has a hard, definitive limit. When a spring is compressed too tightly, it eventually snaps back with explosive, unstoppable force. The dormant volcano inside Jenny was finally beginning to awaken. Sitting in the impenetrable darkness of her despair, Jenny silently began to draft the blueprint of her ultimate liberation. The turning point did not announce itself with shattered glass, echoing screams, or a dramatic, tear-soaked confrontation. It arrived in the suffocating, dead silence of an ordinary afternoon, hanging in the heavy, humid air of a house that had become her tomb. For years, Jenny had fought back with tears, with logic, with desperate pleas for basic human decency, only to be met with the impenetrable brick wall of Sumit's gaslighting and Sadhna's calculated cruelty. But on this specific day, something fundamental snapped within her. The desperate, pleading woman was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating survivor operating with sheer, chilling clarity. She looked around the dimly lit rooms, observing the peeling paint and the oppressive shadows, and finally saw the situation stripped of all romantic illusions. She was not a partner in a struggling relationship. She was a hostage in a psychological war zone. The realization washed over her with the freezing shock of ice water. Sumit did not want to be saved, and he certainly did not want to save her. He was perfectly content reigning over his miserable, deceitful kingdom, feeding off her endless sacrifices. The moment Jenny accepted this horrifying reality, the invisible chains that had bound her to that house simply evaporated. She stopped arguing. She stopped crying. She stopped reacting to Sadhna's venomous jabs and Sumit's pathetic, manipulative apologies. Her sudden, eerie silence was entirely misinterpreted by her captors. They foolishly believed they had finally broken her spirit, that the wild American bird was completely tamed. They had no idea they were merely watching the calm before a devastating hurricane. Beneath the facade of a defeated woman, Jenny was orchestrating a masterclass in stealth and self-preservation. Every move she made was a calculated step in a meticulous blueprint for escape. The logistical nightmare of fleeing a foreign country with drained finances and a shattered psyche would have paralyzed anyone else. But Jenny was fueled by the pure, unadulterated instinct to survive. In the dead of night, while the house slept, oblivious to the rebellion brewing right under their roof, she began to gather the fragmented pieces of her life. Her passport, long hidden away like a forgotten relic of her past freedom, was quietly retrieved. Every spare rupee, every hidden dollar was methodically counted and secured in the dark. She moved through the claustrophobic corridors of that house like a ghost, packing a single bag with only the absolute necessities. She was leaving behind clothes, jewelry, and 10 years of memories, but she was taking back the one thing they had tried so desperately to steal: her soul. The tension in those final hours was thick enough to choke on. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant bark of a street dog sounded like a deafening siren that could bring her carefully constructed plan crashing down. But Jenny's resolve was now coated in titanium. She was no longer waiting for a savior. She had become her own. The actual departure was the ultimate insult to Sumit's ego, executed with terrifyingly calm precision. There was no grand speech, no dramatic final showdown to give him the twisted satisfaction of a fight. One morning, without a single tear or a raised voice, Jenny simply picked up her meticulously packed bag and walked out the door. She did not look back at the walls that had absorbed 10 years of her agony. She did not look back at the man who had traded her dignity for his comfort. She stepped into a waiting taxi, the engine sputtering to life, cutting through the heavy Indian morning air. As the vehicle pulled away, navigating the dusty, labyrinthine streets, Jenny stared out the window, watching the chaotic, suffocating world she had endured for a decade blur into the distance. The physical distance between her and that toxic household grew with every passing mile, and with it, the crushing weight on her chest began to violently fracture and fall away. Walking into the blinding, sterile fluorescent lights of the international airport terminal, she felt the first real breath of air she had taken in years. The heavy, authoritative thud of the immigration officer's stamp on her passport was not just a sound, it was the definitive gavel strike of her liberation. She was out. The physical sensation of the airplane's tires leaving the tarmac was a visceral, earth-shattering moment of detachment. As the heavy aircraft pierced through the clouds, soaring higher into the vast, unrestricted expanse of the sky, Jenny looked down at the shrinking landscape below. 10 years of her life, her youth, her savings, and her endless compromises were down there, buried in the suffocating smog of a colossal lie. But as the plane leveled out, heading west, she did not mourn the lost time. She mourned the woman she used to be, the woman who believed that love required the complete annihilation of the self. Arriving on American soil, stepping out into the crisp, unrestricted air of California, was a jarring system shock. The contrast was violently stark. There were no judgmental stares, no draconian rules dictating her existence, no walls closing in. But physical freedom was only the first step. The psychological detoxification had just begun. Healing from a decade of systematic gaslighting is an agonizing, terrifying process. For months, Jenny had to violently strip away the layers of Sumit's manipulation, constantly fighting the residual echoes of his voice in her head, telling her she was worthless, that she was to blame. She had to completely reconstruct her shattered reality, brick by agonizing brick. In the quiet solitude of her newfound freedom, Jenny underwent a profound and fierce metamorphosis. The trauma that was meant to destroy her instead forged an unbreakable armor around her mind. She realized with absolute, uncompromising certainty that sacrificing your boundaries, your dignity, and your very identity to keep a relationship alive is not an act of profound love. It is an act of self-mutilation. Love that demands you shrink yourself to fit into a cage is nothing but a hostage situation in disguise. She began to reclaim her space in the world, standing taller, speaking louder, her eyes burning with a resurrected, fierce independence. She was no longer the desperate expatriate begging for a crumb of validation. She was a woman who had walked through the fires of hell, looked the devil in the eye, and walked out holding the keys to her own kingdom. The fragile, dependent Jenny was dead and buried. In her place stood a warrior, armed with lethal self-respect and an unshakable boundary, silently preparing herself for the final, inevitable confrontation, a confrontation that would broadcast her resurrection to the world and shatter Sumit's carefully constructed facade once and for all. The inevitable collision course culminated under the unforgiving, blinding glare of the studio lights during the highly anticipated tell-all broadcast. This was not just a television reunion, it was a psychological arena, a digital courtroom where a decade of hidden atrocities would finally be subjected to the merciless spotlight of global scrutiny. The split-screen dynamic framed the agonizing contrast perfectly. On one side, submerged in the grainy, oppressive shadows of his Indian home, sat Sumit. On the other side, broadcasting from the vibrant, sun-drenched expanse of California, sat Jenny. But this was not the same Jenny who had wept on his floor. She was a vision of terrifying, impenetrable calm. Her posture was rigidly straight, forged from the iron of her survival, and her eyes held the cold, calculating stillness of a judge about to deliver a fatal verdict. The digital silence bridging the thousands of miles between them crackled with a suffocating tension, a palpable atmospheric pressure that signaled the imminent destruction of Sumit's entire fabricated universe. Sumit's physical deterioration was spectacularly evident. The once smug manipulator, who had so comfortably wielded his cultural and familial shields, was now sweating profusely under the inescapable lens of public accountability. His eyes darted nervously off camera, his body language practically screaming with the desperate, erratic energy of a cornered animal. Without the physical walls of his house to trap her, without his mother's venomous interference to drown out the truth, Sumit was completely stripped of his weaponry. He attempted to launch his customary psychological maneuvers, deploying the same pathetic, trembling voice he had used for years to pacify her. He offered theatrical apologies, his face twisting into a mask of exaggerated, pitiful remorse, desperately hoping the cameras would immortalize him as the tragic, misunderstood romantic hero who was simply crushed by circumstances. He spun his old web of lies, claiming he was bound by duty, chained by tradition, crying invisible tears for the love he had so brutally squandered. But his pathetic performance slammed face first into an indestructible wall of titanium apathy. Jenny did not flinch. She did not raise her voice. She did not shed a single tragic tear for the audience's entertainment. Instead, she stared through the lens with an unnerving, predatory focus, dissecting his every word with clinical, surgical precision. When she finally spoke, her voice was not laced with the hysterical anger of a scorned lover, but with the terrifying, absolute authority of a woman who had completely conquered her demons. She effortlessly dismantled his psychological defense mechanisms, tearing through his carefully constructed narrative of cultural victimization live on global television. She exposed the anatomy of his abuse, laying bare the grotesque truth that he had weaponized his secret marriage, orchestrated her isolation, and actively participated in the systematic assassination of her character. She did not just accuse him, she intellectually and emotionally annihilated him, stripping away his disguises until nothing remained but the naked, ugly reality of his profound cowardice. The climax of this digital execution arrived when Jenny delivered the definitive, uncompromising thesis of her liberation. She leaned into the camera, her gaze piercing through the digital divide, and stated with bone-chilling clarity that she was no longer the weak, desperately dependent woman he had so ruthlessly exploited. She articulated the darkest truth of their 10-year nightmare. Sumit never possessed the capacity to love her, because true love does not demand the complete, violent obliteration of a partner's identity. He had simply craved a hostage, a convenient, obedient vessel to absorb the toxicity of his life, so he would not have to face it alone. She declared her absolute sovereignty, establishing an unbreachable fortress around her self-respect. She shattered the dangerous myth that perpetual sacrifice is synonymous with devotion. Enduring relentless humiliation and surrendering your fundamental human dignity to keep a toxic relationship on life support is not romance. It is emotional suicide. With a few lethal, perfectly articulated sentences, Jenny reclaimed her narrative, executing a masterstroke of vindication that left Sumit utterly paralyzed in his own digital square, staring into the abyss of his public exposure. As the broadcast concluded and the screens faded to a static black, the suffocating decade-long saga officially flatlined. The psychological chains were completely pulverized. Jenny stepped away from the monitor, breathing in the unpolluted air of her reclaimed existence. She had descended into the darkest, most terrifying depths of relational hell, navigated a labyrinth of psychological torture, and crawled her way back to the surface with her soul fiercely intact. Her monumental escape stands as a visceral, terrifying warning to anyone trapped in the suffocating grip of a manipulative partner. It is a cinematic testament to the explosive power of self-worth. When a human being finally decides that their sanity is no longer negotiable, when they realize that dying a slow, psychological death in the name of love is the ultimate betrayal of the self, they become an unstoppable force of nature. Jenny's 10 years of agony were not in vain. They were the brutal, agonizing forge that constructed an unbreakable woman, proving forever that the most vital, triumphant rescue mission you will ever undertake is the one where you save yourself. Now, if you find yourself captivated by this dark psychological descent into the twisted mechanics of human deception, do not let the momentum die here. Smash the like button immediately to feed the algorithm and ensure these vital stories breach the surface. Subscribe to the channel right now and turn on all notifications so you never miss a moment of our relentless pursuit of the truth. We will continue to rip the masks off these horrifying realities, delivering the chilling narratives that you cannot look away from. Stay vigilant, stay questioning, and I will see you in the next investigation.